you're afraid people think you may have done something.
I just want them people to know that I want my family back. Like, I want them safe.
Look at this photo. A beautiful family. A loving mother. 2 little girls who still slept with stuffed animals. A baby on the way. Now, look at the man standing next to them. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, this man stood in his driveway, in front of news cameras and cried. He begged for his family to come home. He told the whole country he had no idea where they were. What the cameras didn't know is that he had already killed them. His pregnant wife, his 4-year-old daughter, his 3-year-old daughter. And here's the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. One of his daughters woke up during it. She opened her eyes, and she looked right at him. Today, we're going inside one of the most disturbing cases in American true crime history. Stay with me, because this story gets darker before it makes any sense at all. Before we get to the murders, you need to understand something important. This wasn't a family that looked troubled from the outside. This was the family everyone wanted to be. Shanann Watts was one of those people who made everything look effortless. She was loud, funny, warm, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and made you feel like the most important person in the room. She'd survived lupus in her 20s, nearly died, and came back from it fiercer than ever. She met Christopher Watts in 2010 and fell hard. Chris was quiet, almost too quiet, but Shanann loved that about him. She called him her calm in the storm. They got married in 2012, moved to Colorado, bought a house, had a daughter Bella in December 2013, Celeste in July 2015, and by summer of 2018, Shanann was pregnant again 15 weeks. A baby boy. She was already thinking about names. She documented all of it on Facebook. The pregnancy updates, the girls' milestones, the family dinners. She had thousands of followers who genuinely loved watching her life unfold. And here's what makes this case so chilling. The whole time she was posting those videos, her husband was planning to end her life. But wait. Before he became a killer, what was Chris Watts actually like? That's where this story gets complicated. And honestly, kind of terrifying. Because nobody, not one person, saw this coming. Here's what everyone said about Chris Watts after the arrest. He was so normal. He was the last person I would have suspected. He was quiet, but kind. Always waved hello. His co-workers at Anadarko Petroleum said the same thing. Nice guy. Showed up on time. Did his job. Didn't make waves. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. Because underneath that completely ordinary exterior, Chris Watts was living a double life. Sometime in the spring of 2018, he started an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a 30-year-old who worked in his industry. And the moment that affair started, something shifted inside Chris Watts. He became obsessed with the idea of a fresh start. He told Nicole his marriage was basically over, that he and Shanann were done, that he was ready to move on and start a new life. He wasn't lying about wanting out. He was lying about how he planned to get there. Because here's what was happening at home at the same time. Shanann had just found out she was pregnant. She was excited. She thought this baby might actually bring them closer together. She was posting videos about the pregnancy with thousands of people cheering her on. She had no idea her husband was texting another woman about their future together. And when Shanann flew home from a 5-week business trip on the night of August 12th, she walked straight into a trap she never saw coming. 1:48 a.m. August 13th, 2018. Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson drops her off at the house after a long trip. Shanann waves goodbye, walks inside, and Nicole drives away. She had absolutely no reason to worry. What nobody knew was that Chris had already confessed the affair to Shanann during that trip over the phone. So when Shanann walked through that front door at nearly 2 in the morning, she wasn't just exhausted from travel. She was heartbroken. She was confused. She was carrying his baby. And she needed to talk. The girls were asleep. The house was still. And whatever conversation happened between Shanann and Chris in that bedroom, we will never fully know, because only one person survived it. What we do know is this. Christopher Watts strangled his pregnant wife to death. And then, instead of calling for help, instead of calling the police, instead of doing anything a normal human being would do, he went down the hall to his daughter's rooms. Bella was 4. Celeste was 3. He murdered both of them. He then loaded Shanann's body into his work truck, the truck with the Anadarko logo on the side, and drove to a remote oil field site about 45 minutes away, called Server 319. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave. He put his daughters in oil storage tanks. And then he drove home, showered and made coffee. Then started texting Nicole Kessinger good morning. That's the question that has haunted everyone connected to this case. Who commits something this evil and then just goes about their morning? We'll get to that. But first you need to see what happened when he decided to go on camera. Because honestly, this is the part that will make your skin crawl. Before we get to the driveway interview, I need to stop and answer the question every single person asks when they hear this case for the first time. Why would a man murder his pregnant wife and his 2 little girls? Why not just leave? Why not ask for a divorce? Why not walk away? That question has no clean answer. But investigators, psychologists, and the prison confession Chris Watts eventually gave, they paint a picture. And it's a picture that tells us something deeply uncomfortable about how certain people think. When Chris Watts met Nicole Kessinger in the spring of 2018, something clicked inside him that he didn't know how to switch off. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a fantasy in his mind. Nicole represented a new life. A clean slate. No mortgage that was nearly underwater. No Thrive leggings business Shanann was pouring everything into. No pregnancy he hadn't planned for. No 2 children he'd have to co-parent with a woman he no longer loved. He wanted to be free. And he was too cowardly and too cold to get there the normal way. Here's something the headlines often skip past. The Watts family was in serious financial trouble. They had purchased a $400,000 home on one income, Chris's oil field salary. Shanann was deeply invested in a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle Thrive, spending more than the business was bringing in. According to court documents, the family was behind on their mortgage and carrying significant debt. A divorce, with 2 kids, a pregnant wife, and a house they couldn't afford, would have financially destroyed him. In his mind, walking away wasn't just emotionally complicated. It was economically impossible. So he didn't think about leaving. He thought about erasing. Chris had been telling Nicole Kessinger for months that he was essentially separated. Shanann and he were done. That his life was about to change. When Shanann came home from that 5-week trip and the affair was out in the open, the walls started closing in. Chris knew Nicole would find out he had lied. He knew the divorce he'd been promising Nicole was going to be ugly and expensive. He knew Shanann wasn't going to quietly disappear. And that is when something monstrous took over his thinking. Forensic psychologists who analyzed the case have pointed to something chilling in Chris Watts' personality makeup. He didn't have an explosive rage-filled break. He didn't snap in a moment of passion. He planned. What investigators and mental health experts found was a man with deeply suppressed emotions. Someone who had never in his life expressed anger, never set boundaries, never said what he actually wanted. He went along. He nodded. He smiled in family photos. He waved to the neighbors. And underneath all of that politeness, he had completely detached from the people he was supposed to love. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, in his mind, they had become the thing standing between him and the life he wanted. Not his daughters. Not the woman who had built her whole world around being his partner. In the 2019 prison confession, the one he gave to church representatives, Chris Watts talked about the night of the murders in a way that stunned everyone in that room. He didn't describe rage. He didn't describe panic. He described something almost mechanical, detached. Like he had already made a decision and was simply carrying it out. This is the part that breaks people. Even if you accept on some cold, terrible level that a man in a desperate spiral could bring himself to kill his wife. How do you explain the girls? In his 2019 confession, Watts said he killed Bella and Celeste because he didn't think Shanann would leave them behind. He was afraid that in a custody battle, he would lose, and the girls would become a permanent tie back to Shanann, and back to the life he was trying to escape. He also admitted something even darker. He didn't want Shanann to ever be able to use his daughters against him. He killed his children to cut the last remaining thread. There is no psychological framework that makes that okay. There is no trauma history, no financial pressure, no affair, nothing that explains away what he did to those little girls. Some things are just evil. And Chris Watts is proof of that. When Nicole Atkinson couldn't reach Shanann the next morning, she went to the house. Chris answered the door and told her Shanann had left, that they'd had an argument, she'd walked out, he didn't know where she'd gone. Nicole wasn't buying it. She called the police. Now here's where most guilty people would lawyer up and go silent. Chris Watts did the exact opposite. He agreed to go on live television, standing in front of his house, the same house where hours earlier he had killed his daughters. Chris Watts looked directly into the camera and performed the role of a devastated husband. He wiped tears. His voice cracked. He said, "I want them to come back. This house is not complete without them." I've watched that interview multiple times, preparing for this video. And here's what gets me every single time. He's good at it but not perfect. Investigators later pointed out his eyes. The way he looked away at certain moments. The micro-expressions that don't quite match the words. But to a regular person watching at home, he was convincing. The country started rooting for him. People online were already posting about how terrible it must be for this poor husband. Meanwhile, investigators had already found something on a neighbor's security camera. Footage from the early morning hours of August 13th. Chris Watts loading something large. Something wrapped into the back of his truck. Before Shanann's friend ever came to the door. Before he ever told anyone she was missing. Game over. On August 15th, FBI investigators sat Chris Watts down for a formal interview. He kept up the act for a while. Shanann left. He didn't know. He was devastated. Then they showed him what they had. And Chris Watts, clearly panicking, did something so desperate, so unbelievably calculated that jaws dropped in that interrogation room. He didn't confess. He blamed Shanann. He told investigators that he'd seen through the baby monitor Shanann and their daughters. That he'd walked in, confronted her, that things had gotten violent. He looked federal investigators in the eye and tried to frame his wife for killing their children. Investigators didn't believe it for a second. The evidence destroyed his story completely. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. And when search teams reached Server 319 that same day, they found Shanann. They found Bella and they found Celeste. Celeste was 3 years old. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to everything, 3 murders, tampering with remains, and was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms plus 84 additional years. No chance of parole ever. At sentencing, Shanann's father Frank Ruzasek stood in that courtroom barely holding himself together, and spoke about the daughter he raised, about the granddaughters he'd never see again. Chris Watts stared at the floor. But here's what most people don't know, the story had one more chapter. In 2019, while in prison, Chris Watts gave a new confession. This time to church representatives. And this time, for the first time, he told the actual truth. He hadn't killed Shanann first. He had killed Bella and Celeste first in their beds, while they slept. When Shanann came home and discovered what he'd done to their daughters, that is when he strangled her. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She wanted 3 kids, a happy marriage, and a life she could be proud of. She was building it in real time, in front of thousands of people who were cheering her on. Bella liked dinosaurs and making her little sister laugh. Celeste was obsessed with stuffed animals and had her mother's energy. Nico, the name Shanann had been considering for her son, never got a chance to exist outside of her hopes. Christopher Watts is currently in a Wisconsin prison. He will die there. And maybe the most haunting thing about this entire case, the thing I keep coming back to, is how normal it all looked from the outside. A nice house, a growing family, a husband who cried on camera. We assume monsters look like monsters. Chris Watts is proof that sometimes they look like the guy next door. If this case hit you hard, it should. Drop a comment and tell me what moment got you the most. Subscribe if you're new. New case every week. I'll see you in the next one.